The First World War, after it had happened, people were very, very critical of what had happened. Looking back, there was a tremendous upsurge of pacifist criticism of what had taken place. And it was commonplace to talk about the war as, the First World War, as an imperialist war, a war where nobody was on the side of good, that people had grabbed territory here and there, and that it was even talked of as a boss's war, a land-grabbing war, a war stirred up by munitions makers, a war where ordinary people were sacrificed on the battlefield to the glory of their generals, and generally not a good thing. The Second World War, we are told, was very different.
There's a moral clarity, at least in British constructions, of the Second World War, whereas the First World War is usually narrated in terms of tragedy, waste, lost generation. We can think of recent Blackadder series as a great popular retelling of that story of the First World War. The Second World War is much easier to couch in terms of a triumph of good over evil. We may want to question that, but that's an easy way to tell it, of the triumph of democracy over Nazi dictatorship, the evils of the Holocaust, and that moral clarity gives the story a lot of power in all sorts of popular mythology.
By the time you get to 1942 and 1943, there are sufficient stories of Nazi atrocities against civil populations, for the most part, but also against military personnel, for the war to be given a hugely moral slant, which of course continues on into the post-war. It continues on through the war crimes trials and all the other apparatus that goes with the unconditional surrender of Germany. But one can see the same thing in terms of other countries where they have to look at their experience of war in terms of good and evil. And anybody who comes in and tries to relativise this gets shot down in flames by a proportion of the population at least.
We're told that essentially it's different because fascism is very different. It introduces a new factor into the equation. Because if it's a war between fascism and democracy, then clearly there is a good and a bad in the war.
If you went out on the street in the 1960s and asked people who was the Second World War fought against, you could get quite a wide range of answers, but they would more or less fall into two distinct camps. One group would say either the Nazis or fascists, and the others would say the Germans or the Hun. And this would give you a very good indication of where they stood politically on this issue. In other words, the war was actually fought, in British eyes at least, for different causes, either nationalist on the one hand or ideological on the other.
Now, of course, it's true. Fascism does indeed introduce a unique element into the equation. Fascism was unique as a movement. It was unique in that it mobilised millions of people as a counterweight to the left. It was a mass movement that transformed the state. And it was also the way the fascist state operated was something of a departure from the way states had been organised before, to say the least. So I don't want to say there was nothing unique about fascism, but I also want to say that fascism was not so unique in the way that states were organised at that time. Or, to put it another way, it's not quite true to say that the Allies were liberal Democrats. You know, when you look at the Allied war effort, it's just not true to say liberal democracy was arraigned against fascism. In fact, there were very authoritarian and militarised societies. There were societies that organised their industry pretty much on fascistic lines. It was a directed industry where, both in Britain and America, where there were special war regulations which said that you could be told where to go to work. People were made to work for nothing, overtime. Their living standards were depressed severely by rationing. at the same time that they were made to work much harder. And it was also illiberal, profoundly illiberal society, in that people were imprisoned for their political views. Now, obviously, we know that in Britain, British Union and fascist supporters were imprisoned for their political views, and maybe you don't particularly care about that. But you might care that also leftists were imprisoned for their political views. The members of the War Resisters newspaper were tried and imprisoned for opposing the war. People were executed for opposing the war. Opponents of the war were detained. Opponents of the war were detained in the United States as well. And the whole of those societies, under the war emergency, was placed under a kind of a military discipline. Furthermore, in the way that they dealt with the rest of the world, the liberal democracies, so-called, of the Allies, were also profoundly illiberal. They treated the colonies as effectively a repository of slaves. They enslaved people to make rubber. They enslaved people in Zimbabwe, in Rhodesia. People were empowered, British officers were empowered to round up natives at gunpoint and put them to work making air bases as pressed labour. In India, which was a British colony, India was made to join the war against the will of its own people. And for that very reason, the largest party in India, the Congress Party, rose up in protest and effectively in revolt against the British Empire and against the decision to make them join the war. And when they did that, they were gunned down. Tens of thousands of people were killed in the suppression of the uprising in India. The leaders of the Congress Party were arrested and sent to prison, those of them that had survived the initial outrage. These were not liberal societies at all. On the contrary, they treated their colonial subjects with the same disinterest as essentially little more than factors of production, as the fascists treated their colonial subjects that they had seized in other parts of the world. Now, we know that in the war, the conquered peoples who were under Axis rule resisted, which they did. You know, in Greece and Yugoslavia and France were important resistance movements that played a great role in changing the course of the war. But what's not often acknowledged is that there was mass opposition also to the Allied war effort amongst the peoples that they were dominating. I've talked about the struggle that the Congress undertook in India. Also across the Middle East, in Iraq, the revolt there, the Iraqi people rose up. There was fighting in Iran. Iran, a little-known fact of the Second World War, was divided in an Anglo-Soviet invasion, the country cut in two by Britain and the Soviet Union. And to enforce that occupation, people were slaughtered, and the whole country was reduced to penury and near starvation. You know, in the Far East, we know about the nationalists who collaborated with Japan. You know, many of the different nationalist groups, like Aung San, leader of the Burmese Thakin movement, collaborated with the Japanese to drive the British out of the colonies. We know about the Indian National Army, based amongst Indian expatriates living throughout the Far East, who joined with the Japanese to fight against Britain, to liberate their country. That was their goal. These are not stories that are told because they don't fit our idea of a people's war against fascism. How could it be that the people are fighting against us when we are the heroes of the war? And we know that at the end of the war, that anti-fascists in Greece, the Elas movement, and in Indonesia and Malaya, these people that have been fighting against the Axis powers, they again, in turn, fought against the Allies when those countries were taken back, and that there was a sustained war between British troops and Greek resistance fighters, in which the collaborators, the pro-Nazi collaborators, the German collaborators called security battalions, changed their uniforms and fought alongside the British to defeat the Greek resistance movement. So we know that we come to find out more and more that this is not really a war which makes freedom against dictatorship, but also has that same character as the First World War, of a war in which people are fighting to divide the world between them. They are fighting to divide the world between them, not for liberal democracy, but for the defence of the colonies and for the defence of their particular interests. And my minute is up, my 10 minutes are up. So all I really want to say on the question of national identity, we in Britain especially have a national identity which is derived from a particular myth of the Second World War in which we are the good. But we have never confronted our imperial problems because we were the victors. We were at least formally the victors. But we the ordinary people, we never were the victors. We were just the cannon fodder. It was our leaders who were the victors. And it was they and their imperial system that came out of the war enhanced. And we, as its not always willing subjects, came out of the war as subservient.
Was it the right and moral thing to have gone to war in 1939? Because I presume that's the basis for the myth. You debunked the myth by suggesting that it wasn't. And maybe to think that one through, if Britain had not gone to war and kept to its own, and dare I say, done in Ireland, where would we be now? Would the world be a better or a worse place?
The question I think that puts me on the spot best is should they have gone to war? You know, and that, I think that's a good one. And my evasion is that I'm not necessarily prepared to take responsibility for the executive government of the British Empire. I'm not Churchill. If I was, I suppose I would have behaved pretty much as, I suppose, I might have behaved as Churchill did, because that was what was clearly in the interests of the British Empire, not the British people, certainly not the people of India. Were they right to engineer the Bengal famine and 3.5 million killed? No, I think that was outrageously wrong. Were they right to give Poland a blank cheque? Many leaders made the point that actually that was an insane thing to do, to give the Poles the final decision of whether Britain went to war. I think much more important, this is my evasion if you like, I would say, were the people who opposed the war right? Was James Maxton and Vera Brittain and CLR James, were the people who tried to organise an anti-war movement in Britain and in America, in the Allied countries, were they right? I think they were. I think they were, because it was important to make the break with British imperialism. It was important to try and make the world different. People under the Axis, they, some collaborated and some resisted. They were making the break. No doubt those two groups of people would find it very difficult to understand each other, but it was important that the war resistors made the break, and they took the chance of organising opposition to Britain's military efforts. And they did it, and it's very good. You know, read War Resistors. I'm not an anarchist, but it's fantastic writing in the midst of the Second World War, where they talked consistently about what the war really meant in India, what it meant in Malaya, what it meant in Singapore. And they did the right thing. They fought against war. You know, it's usually Max Hastings' job, not Andrew Marr's, to write the More in Sorrow Than Anger review of the latest piece of revisionist expose of Allied atrocities. And it always ends with the same paragraph, but of course there is something worthwhile fighting for, blah, blah, blah. But it's evacuated in essence. I think it's a losing battle. Why I've written my thing is kind of to put it to bed. You know, I think the myth of the People's War has been creaking along, and I'm very happy just to throw the last sod of earth on top of the thing. Never forget was, we must never forget was one of the great slogans of the war. And I think, in the broad sense of things, we should forget about it. It'd be great to kind of forget about it. Historians should write history, that's good, and we should try and understand what happened, but we don't need to be overawed by the past. I think the thing that was you know, we've been looking at all these pictures all evening. The thing that I think that was so repulsive about the Donner and Blitz and Handy Hock militarism was there was always a secret message in the back of it which said, you must obey. Obey. The sacrifice that your fathers made means that you must be obedient. You think you're critical? Shut up, because we made sacrifices so that you could say these things. And it's always had, because it's the secret meaning of the war, it's about the reassertion of authority within that context. And it's always really meant you should, end your criticism now. And if we're free of that, I think that's a fantastic thing.